K-12 education is the least disrupted industry in our country. We spend $750 billion a year.
When it comes to education, America is using a 175-year-old industrial model approach, argues former U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. She is one of the very few department heads to have advocated for the abolition of the agency she ran.
We don't even begin to understand the breadth and magnitude of the learning loss, the negative impact on kids, particularly the most vulnerable kids, low-income kids during the pandemic. And you couple the learning losses with the mental health challenges, and you have a disaster looming.
DeVos is the author of the new book, Hostages No More: The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. Tonight, she breaks down creative new approaches to schooling being adopted in states like Florida and Arizona that could soon change the game for millions of children across America.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kelly. Betsy DeVos, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you, Jan. It's great to be with you.
It's been several years since we spoke last. You were the Secretary of Education at the time, and you were getting, I think it's an understatement to say, a ton of flack for just about anything that you were trying to do. And you've written about it in your book. What is it like to be outside of government now? Like, how has your life changed?
Well, I've been busy writing this book, which is about how we actually fix American education. And it's been very, I would say, energizing and cathartic at the same time. And I'm continuing to advocate for kids and for their family's ability to direct their own child's education, as I had for 30 years before I went to Washington. So in that regard, not much has changed. I just am able to do it now with a different perspective and a different set of experiences. And I'm working with governors and state legislators and some of our federal elected officials as well to really promote and advance policies that are going to empower families to do just that.
So tell me about this different perspective. Like, what is it that what were the big lessons of being in an administration?
Well, it only confirmed further for me what I knew before even going there, and that is the federal government does not do education well. It is not involved in education in a good and positive and constructive way. It is really the purview of the family and the most local units of government that really have to be able to take charge of and control for the kids' education. And we're seeing this happen now in more meaningful ways across the country, with Arizona being the most recent state, the first state to enact a universal education freedom policy, which is going to change the life trajectories for thousands of kids in that state. I'm very excited about that. I'm also excited about how that's going to continue to build momentum in other states for the policy changes necessary to do that same thing.
And so it's interesting to me because you were the head of, a large federal department. Of course, education is left to the states, but there's been all sorts of federal mechanisms created to be able to influence the states with time, right?
Yes, well, people often don't realize the fact that only 8 or 9% of funding for education, for K-12 education, comes from the federal government. And yet the regulations and all of the policies that directly impact state and local education are far beyond that 8 or 9%. And so there are a lot of strings attached to the money that government sends and funds for K-12 education. I contend that that money is better spent when directed by families from the state level as well. And I use the metaphor of a backpack. Kids go to school every day with the stuff they need for the day. Metaphorically, we should attach the funds that are already being spent on that child to that child's backpack for that family to figure out, is there assigned school working for them? If not, let's figure out where is going to work. And education, K-12 education, is the least disrupted industry in our country. And it is an industry. We spend $750 billion a year on K-12 education, and we continue to get poorer and worse results in spite of the fact of spending more and more and more money. if we would empower families with those resources to make those buying decisions, we will get the creativity and ingenuity and entrepreneurship we need in K-12 learning experiences that we haven't had to date with a 175-year-old industrial model approach.
What place is there, if any, for a federal Department of Education? I've had someone on the show very recently who simply said, do away with it all, right?
I concur with that. I think the department should not exist. It was a payoff to the teachers' unions that Jimmy Carter made in 1979, or 76 when he was running for election, and it was actually effected or implemented in 1979. We have since then spent over $1 trillion at the federal level alone with the express goal of closing the achievement gaps. Not only have those gaps not narrowed one little bit, by most measures they've actually widened. And so there is no compelling reason for having a federal Department of Education. There are a couple of laws that need to be, we need to make sure are followed, protecting civil rights and making sure children with disabilities have the kinds of supports they need. But those don't need to exist in a federal department. They can exist in another already established department and be overseen very well in those places. The federal Department of Education does not add any value to kids' educations.
You're perhaps the first department head I'm aware of who's advocating for the abolition of the department that they headed.
I did, while I was there, I said I would be very happy to work myself out of a job. And in fact, the last two budgets that we presented to Congress actually sought to block grant all of the funds to the states and local districts. Congress didn't take it up seriously to even debate it. I hope they do. I think it's a very worthy discussion, particularly with how we've seen the system act and respond this last 2 years, when families have had a front row seat to see firsthand the failings of the system.
You know, I want to talk about this Arizona law that you mentioned earlier. It's obviously like a major development. Before we go there, I just want to touch a little bit on, this past administration. You actually quit following January 6th. You said that President Trump had crossed a red line. I want to give you a chance just to kind of say your piece, like what exactly happened so people understand what your position was very clearly before we continue.
Well, to put it a little more in context, following the election in November, during the rest of November and December, when there was debate happening around a second COVID relief package, there was a very real opportunity to get a school choice education freedom provision included in that bill. But the White House was not focused on doing those kinds of things and advocating for that kind of policy, and so what could have been wasn't. And my role, my job, focusing on doing the right things and everything we could for students, I'd pretty much come to the end of what we could possibly accomplish.